She sat in the courtroom in Knoxville, Tennessee, her voice strangely calm, as she recounted the night her 5-year-old daughter stopped breathing. As if that day's hearing were just another routine account of events, rather than the moment that would decide how many years of her life she'd spend behind bars for what happened to her own daughter right there in her living room. At first, Robin told police,
I had a man that just came to the door, man, and I don't know what the hell happened.
When that story fell apart, she changed course and pointed the finger at Destiny's biological father. But once the case reached trial, her defense attorney offered a completely different explanation: that the gun had gone off on its own while Robin was stepping outside to move her car and smoke a cigarette, and that the whole incident was nothing more than a tragic accident, not an intentional act. At first, the defense's argument seemed reasonable. The jury considered it, but then the prosecution presented layer after layer of evidence, and everything changed. What you're about to see is the moment the jury realized that security camera footage showed Robin herself wiping down the gun and hiding it in a bush right after the shots were fired, and that a claim of an accidental discharge simply didn't square with the actions of a mother trying to erase evidence, rather than one panicking to save her child. And every detail you're about to see has been verified through the Knoxville Police Department's investigative files, the security camera footage presented by the prosecution in court, court records, and the official sentencing handed down on April 19, 2024. This is a case that shocked the entire Fountain City community in Knoxville. A 5-year-old girl lost her life inside her own home while her mother kept changing her story. First blaming a stranger, then the child's biological father, and finally, the victim's own 2-year-old brother. If you've never heard this story before, brace yourself, because what happened in Fountain City, Knoxville, Tennessee on September 14, 2019 will challenge everything you thought you knew about a mother's love and about how far someone will go to dodge responsibility for the consequences of her own actions. To understand why Robin Howington was sentenced to a total of 35 years, with 22 years to actually serve, we have to go back to the beginning, to the everyday life of the Howington family, up to the fateful evening when little Destiny was no longer with them. In the quiet Fountain City neighborhood of Knoxville, Tennessee, a modest home on Balsam Drive held a family that, on the surface, looked like countless others in the area. Robin Howington, 36 years old, lived there with her 2 young children, 5-year-old Destiny Oliver and her 2-year-old son, Gavin. Destiny's biological father, Antoine Oliver, lived elsewhere and was not part of the household, though he remained a presence in his daughter's life. At the time, Howington was also involved in a new relationship with a man named Daniel Hensley. Just days before the shooting that would end Destiny's life, tension inside that world boiled over into something far more alarming. According to an account Hensley later gave to investigators, he personally witnessed a confrontation in the front yard of the Balsam Drive home, one in which Howington pulled a gun and pointed it directly at Antoine Oliver. Oliver managed to wrestle the weapon away from her and unload it before the situation escalated further. That single moment, a gun drawn in anger just days earlier, would later become a central thread Howington tried to weave into her account of what happened next. An explanation for why a firearm ended up somewhere so easily accessible inside her home. On September 14, 2019, the family had spent part of the day at a local park. By the time they returned home, both children were drowsy from the outing. Howington brought them inside, settling Destiny onto the living room sofa to watch Netflix, while Gavin stayed nearby. According to Howington's own account, she then stepped outside to smoke a cigarette and move her car, which she said was blocking the mailbox and interfering with the mail carrier's delivery. She would later testify that as she walked back toward the house, she glanced through the glass door and saw a flash of light. Stepping inside, she found Gavin crying and clearly frightened, and Destiny motionless on the sofa, a handgun lying on the floor nearby. But forensic testimony presented later in court told a different story. Dr. Amy Hawes, deputy medical examiner and forensic pathologist testifying at trial, stated that the weapon had been fired at extremely close range, directly contradicting Howington's claim that she had been outside when the shot was fired. Destiny suffered a single gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet also struck her hand and damaged a nearby television remote before coming to rest. What happened in the moments immediately following the shooting would prove just as significant as the shooting itself. Security camera footage recovered from a neighboring home captured Howington discarding the firearm almost instantly after Destiny was shot, attempting to conceal it beneath a bush near the house. She then placed a call to 911, telling the dispatcher that an unknown man had broken into the home and shot her daughter before fleeing in a black Chrysler 300. Knoxville Police Department officers responded to that 911 call and arrived to find a scene that did not yet reveal the full truth. Destiny was rushed to the University of Tennessee Medical Center, where she was later pronounced dead from her injuries. At the hospital staff and officers noticed troubling behavior from Howington. She was observed attempting to pass her cell phone, along with a sum of cash, to a witness inside a hospital bathroom. When officers seized the phone and later spoke with that witness, they were told Howington did not want investigators to have access to the device because it contained evidence related to drug sales. As the investigation unfolded, detectives Tim Riddle and Brandon Wardlaw sat down with Howington for questioning, and her account of what happened that night began to shift, again and again, over the course of a single evening. Her first version placed blame on a stranger who had broken into the home. Later in that same interview, she changed course entirely, telling detectives the real shooter was Antoine Oliver, claiming he had come to the house and shot Destiny following an argument. Then, in text messages sent while she sat in the back of a patrol car on the way to the hospital, Howington wrote that it was actually Gavin, her 2-year-old son, who had pulled the trigger. That final version became the story she would maintain going forward, the one she ultimately told detectives and later repeated under oath at trial. Investigators were arrested by the sheer volume of inconsistencies. Detective Wardlaw would later testify that from the outset, their goal that night had simply been to determine who had killed Destiny, nothing more. But as they worked through Howington's shifting statements, cracks began to appear that could not be explained away. She had moved a spent shell casing at the scene before detectives had even located it themselves, a casing they would not actually recover from inside the couch until several days later. And the neighbor's security footage, once compared against the timestamps of her own story, systematically dismantled her account piece by piece, most damningly in the moment it captured her disposing of the weapon and hiding it under a bush, something she had flatly denied doing when first questioned. Officers arrested Robin Howington shortly after the shooting on 2 counts of tampering with evidence. On December 2, 2019, she appeared in court and waived her right to a preliminary hearing, sending her case forward to a grand jury. She was ultimately indicted on charges including first-degree murder under a felony murder theory, meaning prosecutors allege Destiny's death occurred during the commission of aggravated child neglect, along with additional charges of child neglect, false reporting, tampering with evidence, and attempted tampering with evidence. The case, initially expected to go to trial in April 2021, would not actually reach a courtroom for nearly 3 more years. When the trial finally began in March 2024 inside Knox County Criminal Court, prosecutors laid out for the jury the full pattern of Howington's shifting statements and her repeated efforts to interfere with the investigation. Defense attorney Mike Whalen pushed back against how police had handled the case from its earliest hours, arguing that Detective Riddle had raised his voice and applied excessive pressure on Howington the very night her daughter died, rather than allowing her time to process what had happened before being questioned further. Dr. Hawes returned to the stand to reaffirm her forensic findings, testifying that the firearm had been fired at close range, a detail that continued to undercut Howington's account of standing outside when the shot rang out. Howington herself eventually took the stand in her own defense, walking the jury through her final version of events: the day at the park, bringing the children inside, stepping out to smoke and move her car, and the flash of light she said she saw through the glass door before finding her children inside. The defense argued that it was law enforcement, not Howington, who first arrived at the theory that Antoine Oliver had pulled the trigger, and that Howington had simply agreed with that theory after being pressed by detectives during questioning. According to this argument, she had not been the one changing her story at all, but rather following the lead investigators themselves had suggested. Still, under cross-examination, Howington acknowledged trying to destroy her cell phone at the hospital because she feared it contained evidence of drug sales. And she admitted to wiping down and hiding the firearm in the aftermath of the shooting. After roughly 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Robin Howington was found guilty of reckless homicide, a significantly lesser charge than the felony murder count she had originally faced, along with 5 additional charges: 2 counts of aggravated child neglect, false reporting, tampering with evidence, and attempted tampering with evidence. Sentencing took place on April 19, 2024, before Judge G. Scott Green. Assistant District Attorney General Ashley McDermott read an emotional statement on behalf of Destiny's father, Antoine Oliver, who had once been a suspect himself based largely on Howington's own shifting statements, and who had been unable to attend his daughter's funeral while the investigation remained unresolved. In his statement, Oliver said Howington had ruined his life while he was still trying to process the death of his baby girl, calling her a lowlife who cared nothing for Destiny and only for herself, and stating plainly that she was the reason his daughter was dead. Assistant District Attorney General Heather Good added that testimony at trial had revealed Howington's involvement in drug transactions in the period before her daughter was shot. Judge Green told the courtroom he had, in his own words, quit counting how many lies Howington told in the aftermath of her daughter's death. He further noted that her claim that the weapon had been left in an accessible location because of a confrontation days earlier with Destiny's father strained credulity. The mitigating factors presented by the defense, he said, carried little weight in his final decision. In the end, Robin Howington was sentenced to a combined 35 years across her 6 convictions. Because those sentences were ordered to run concurrently, she will serve 22 years in prison. As of the most recent reporting, no public appeal has been confirmed in the case, which closed with a sentence that, for Destiny's father and for the community that followed the story, still left behind more questions than answers about a mother whose account of her daughter's death changed as many times as the truth allowed her to hide from it. The case of Destiny Oliver leaves behind a troubling truth: that the people meant to protect a child are not always the ones who tell the truth about what happened to her. A 5-year-old girl lost her life inside her own home, and in the hours and days that followed, her mother chose deception over honesty, shifting blame from a stranger to a father to a toddler, rather than facing what actually occurred. The clearest message from this case is that a firearm left within reach of young children, combined with a pattern of instability and dishonesty, can turn an ordinary evening into an irreversible tragedy. This case is a sober reminder of how essential safe firearm storage truly is in any home with children present, and how quickly a single moment of carelessness can end a life that can never be given back. It also shows how repeated dishonesty, even when meant to protect oneself, only deepens the pain of everyone left behind, especially a grieving father wrongly cast under suspicion. For anyone reflecting on this story, the lesson is simple but urgent. Secure every firearm, tell the truth without hesitation, and remember that a child's safety must always come before self-protection.